Did you know that senior officials in the White House and CIA were involved in a scandal where they sold weapons illegally to Iran, took the profits from that, which were made behind the backs of Contras, and spent them, again, illegally, on a military, like a paramilitary force in Nicaragua called the Contras. You know, you can call the force what you want, thugs, whatever. Also, it wasn't just one force, there were huge factions. In fact, the Contras were kind of a group of forces. But this all happened. And it all happened at the same time. The funds, the profits were spent, were created illegally and problematically too, and spent illegally and really problematically. And this is a story that involves a number of countries. It's not just Iran, the US, and Nicaragua. There were intermediaries who were very important. The biggest one being Israel. Another one which frustrated things for them is Portugal. Yeah. So this is a story of the Iran-Contra Affair. I don't know how long this episode is going to be. This is, by the way, the first episode of my podcast. And yeah, so let's get into it. I have a collection of notes here. So the Iran-Contra Affair. Okay, I was about to tell you when the affair started, but then I realised that that's kind of a waste of time because, as with any historical thing, when does anything start? So let's talk about a couple of the preceding events that are really important for context and that are just frankly interesting. Like, I found this whole episode, researching it, really exciting. Not just because it's the first episode of my real podcast, although there's that and that's really exciting, but also, like, it's just a very, to me, intellectually, I was going to say thrilling, but like intellectually stimulating topic that's kind of at a level, for me at least, that's like just above like what is easy to comprehend. Like, I'd say it's like 25% harder what I would consider easy to comprehend. One of the videos I watched for it, in fact, I didn't finish this video, but it was good nonetheless. He was saying that like even some of his best history students have trouble with this, and often he doesn't actually cover this in his American history courses because it takes a lot of time to teach. So don't worry, you've got me. I'll hold your hand on your way through and we'll get through this. So I feel like the first thing worth noting, obviously, is that the Cold War was a thing. I'm sure you know that. It started in, just after World War II and ended in, 1989 or 1991, depending on how you see things. I'd say 1989. It's also kind of complicated because if you say 1991, then you miss bits. So just say 1989, kind of when it ended. And this was happening in the kind of early 80s. Early mid. The preceding events happened in the early 80s, okay? This affair happened in the mid 80s. And also, it's important to recognise that no one saw the end of the Cold War coming. Like, it wasn't like you know, Iran-Contra Affair came around and they were all like, oh, okay, well, you know, we've just got a few more years of this kind of shenanigan. Because quite frankly, no one knew. It's just there. Next thing is the president at the time, Ronald Reagan. Now Reagan, he's a bit of a controversial figure. Not just because of the Iran-Contra Affair. Funnily, it like when you kind of look at timelines of like Reagan's popularity, like it seems like the Iran-Contra Affair, you know, was somewhat, not just somewhat, it was something which people considered. It wasn't like, it wasn't forgotten, but I think, how do I put this, like I think Reagan's general political view of the world and stuff is what really kind of made him controversial. Like the Iran-Contra Affair was kind of icing on the cake for people who already didn't like him. And yeah, and it was, I don't know. I watched this one kind of lecture by the guy who wrote a book recently on Iran-Contra. He had a question, and one of the questioners asked, why wasn't the Iran-Contra Affair a big scandal? Sorry, like, why wasn't it a big talking point in the next election? And he kind of pushed up against that. He said, no, it was definitely a talking point in the next election. But yeah, I kind of think that the questioner is kind of onto something. Like, I think, like from what I can see, the things which really annoyed people about Reagan were way above the Iran-Contra Affair. Yeah, anyway, so Reagan, he was a movie star, and then he got into politics in California. I think he became the governor of California, and then you know, he ran for president. You know, I still don't understand how presidential elections work in the US. Like, people from the same party really go at each other, and that's not something you see here. And I think it's a structural thing, like the design of their political system. But yeah, he was running up against someone else. The preceding president, or the incumbent at the time when he was running, was Jimmy Carter. Yeah, so he was after Jimmy. He took the throne from Jimmy. And Jimmy is like a pretty uncontroversial figure, but it's kind of like one of those things where, like, when you're so uncontroversial, you paradoxically are not only like, yeah, you're paradoxically disliked. Like, we had a Prime Minister here in Australia, Kevin Rudd, who was always trying to be uncontroversial and trying to be friends with the press and you know, say all the things that, you know, are popular to say, but he just wouldn't do anything. And also, like, he seemed to be caring so much about his own image that the actual progressing of the country was kind of second or whatever. That's kind of the criticisms of him. I don't know much about him. That's just what I've heard from people at the time who voted. Yeah, so Jimmy was kind of uncontroversial and I think considered a bit weak. I don't know much about his presidency, but yeah, I mean, the hostage crisis, the Iran hostage crisis, occurred in Jimmy's presidency, and it took quite some time for that to be resolved. And although I don't think it's fair to 100% blame the president for something like that, that sort of thing does rub off on a president. You know, just like how if the economy is going bad, people will blame the leader. It's that sort of thing. Anyway, so Jimmy was obviously voted out, or Reagan was voted in. Take a breath, take a breath. I'm really nervous. That, by the way, is a chocolate. What do you call it? An iced chocolate. I still don't drink coffee. I actually drank one coffee in the making of this script. These notes. And my God, that was an incredibly productive morning, I will say. So yeah, the Iran hostage crisis actually ended 3 hours into Ronald Reagan's presidency, which is very interesting. And there's a lot probably to talk about in that. But this whole episode, all of this stuff, like there are so many rabbit holes you could go down, and I'm really trying to keep it on the straight and narrow. But I will say that apparently there was a big conspiracy theory about conspiracy theory, like as in everything is a conspiracy theory until it's proven. But there was kind of conspiracy theory that Reagan and the political leader of Iran were speaking. I can't tell you who the political leader of Iran was, because I'm pretty sure they have a bunch. And it's kind of like, I mean, in a lot of cases, in kind of any system, really, I certainly know that it happened from time to time in the Soviet Union. They kind of have like a leader who's like nominally supposed to be the most powerful, but then you know, there's kind of another leader who's maybe nominally supposed to be slightly less powerful, who actually is powerful, you know, according to historians or whatever. So yeah, I think it's kind of one of those things. So there was the Iran hostage crisis, and Iran and the US had been enemies since the recent revolution, 1979 Iranian Revolution. So it was an Islamic revolution away from kind of at least nominally secular Iran, and the US didn't like it. Generally the US is okay with anyone governing any country, just as long as the government of that country likes the US, or, you know, can get along with the US. I mean, I always find those pictures of Western leaders in big groups of Saudis, like, you know, the Saudi, whatever their equivalent of like Parliament House or White House is, like, and they're all head to toe in like traditional garb, but also like very practical clothing for the summer, except that in air conditioned like places, and like all of them are there, like it's dominated by them, and then there's like Boris Johnson or something in his suit, smile. So yeah, so that's kind of Iran. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure before the revolution it was kind of a much more like westernized place, in the sense of like freedom of expression, freedom of speech, those sorts of things. You know, not wildly Western, but a bit. And then kind of after this whole, you know, revolution, that was kind of lost even further. And then there's Nicaragua. Nicaragua had Nicaragua is a country in Central America, which means, you can get out a map if you want to, but should I have my globe here? So this is Iran, right? So that's kind of, Europe is, where's Europe? I'm trying to get it right. Europe is there. Africa is there. The Middle East is here, kind of. And that's Iran. Oh yeah, I was going to say, another country I forgot about being involved is Saudi Arabia, in this Iran-Contra scandal. And then, all the way on the other side of the globe, spin it around, spin it around, spin it around, spin it around, to the so-called New World. Now, I'm actually going to have to look at this, because we get the wrong one. They are very small states. Okay, this purple dude, purple man, funnily they're both purple. I don't know if you can see it. Not the big Mexico, but go on. That is Nicaragua. And obviously that is the United States, in case you hadn't realised. Okay, I'm gonna pop you down. Okay, so Nicaragua was, I'm gonna say, colonized by the Spanish. It was also, there's also a British part. I don't know, I think the British part came kind of later on, like as British Empire got stronger, the Spanish Empire got weaker. A little bit later on, the British took a bit, and that's kind of the East Coast. And on the East Coast, it's not the song, like. So that's kind of the East Coast. And then on the other side, actually, this is something I was wondering when I was taking notes on it, because Belize is also on the east coast of Central America. I wonder if the British actually had a thing all the way down. Yeah. Also, the Nicaragua was in this like Mexican Empire thing, which is another thing I know nothing about. And then it was in this like, I don't know, like coalition of South American states. I don't know whether it was a confederation or a federation, but it was in it. It was in it for some time. This is all, I think, from Wikipedia. So Nicaragua was in the first Mexican Empire in 1822. And that lasted an extremely long time, because then it was in the United Provinces of Central America from 1823 to 1838. And then it was an independent republic starting 1838. But then there's this whole little side gig about the British deciding that it didn't want what I think is called the Blue Fields. Again, that eastern part. British are like, no, we don't want that anymore. It's not profitable enough. It's a waste of money. So they got rid of it, and I can't quite work it out, but it seems like they gave it to Honduras, who then decided they didn't want it, and they gave it to Nicaragua, or they originally allocated it to Honduras, and then they just changed their mind and allocated it to Nicaragua. If it's the latter one, then it's, to me, a big waste of time for Wikipedia to actually put that in the article, because. So yeah, and then after that, it had this little US occupation time, which is kind of an interesting thing, because like, what you call it is obviously contested, specifically by the US. And I don't know whether to call it an occupation or not, but it seems to me like it was at least being kind of puppeteered by the US. Apparently the US wanted to set up a canal through it, and then they changed their mind. But while they were wanting to set up the canal, they put I think a couple of navy posts out or something, a couple of military commands. Nothing massive. From 1912 to 1933, they were occupied by the US. And yeah, I mean, I have a note here. I was like, I don't know what effect this had on the economy, but I assume that it was largely an extractive relationship, as in the US was kind of taking resources from Nicaragua. And so then the US left, and between then and the Iran-Contra Affair, only a couple of things happened really. It became undemocratic monarchy or something. I'll have to look that up. But then it became actually, this is a whole nother point. This is from ChatGPT. Before Nicaragua became a socialist state under the Sandinista government in 1979. You notice that? You notice the 1979 has popped up 2 times? What was the first time? What was the first time? It was the Iranian Revolution, also. That is an interesting, and I imagine that's not a coincidence. The Americans were probably thinking about both the same thing, that they're probably in the, in the foreign policy room, and they were all thinking about, oh, bloody hell, these bloody governments that don't get along with us. They're thinking about how this recent revolution, which was only a few years earlier, they're thinking about it, and then they were like, oh, and there was also that other revolution that is just constantly in their heads, and that when both of those things are constantly in your head, then you get creative and you're thinking about both of them at the same time, the Iran-Contra Affair. What was it? So before Nicaragua became a socialist state under the Sandinista government in 1979, it experienced a period of political turbulence and dictatorial rule. Yeah, that's kind of what I was talking about. From my understanding, Nicaragua, from my understanding and my opinion, Nicaragua has never been a democratic country, sadly. It had, I read a whole article about its recent politics, and in 1990, there was an election which was kind of called by international media and by the US as democratic. In the article, he said that actually calling this 1990 election democratic is probably a lot influenced by the general kind of optimism, and he was writing it in 1990. He was very he was really foreseeing the future in terms of people now seeing democratic backsliding everywhere. It's kind of going the other way, really. But yeah, he was saying that interpreting this Nicaraguan election as democratic is probably a lot to do with general optimism, and only partially to do with the actual kind of facts of what it is. And by the way, even if you do call that election democratic, it was not very long for this is why I don't think it was ever really democracy. I feel like you have to have quite a few election cycles that are contested and peacefully won and transparent, and you have to have other things like free speech and just basic things, that separation of powers between the legislature and the judiciary and the executive, at least some, for democracy to really be a thing. So I feel like you need a number of election cycles, and it was not very long before there's some really elections. And I'm pretty sure they've had a leader now for some time. Daniel Ortega. Yeah. He's been head of state since 2007. It is now 2023. He's been there since the iPhone came out. The first iPhone. Now we're up to iPhone 15. I think that some of its current kind of problem, it's not like El Salvador or whatever, like a couple doors over, where there's some kind of significant like violence problems. Nicaragua's not really like that. Not so much. But it is still a poor country, and you have to think that maybe if they had actually had like democratic capitalism, they could have become a bit less poor, and they could have been kind of less kind of extracted from, because when, I don't know, I mean, I have complicated views on how democracy and capitalism mix. So there's these dynasties. The Somoza dynasty ruled for 40 years. His oppressive rule led to widespread discontent and resistance from various sectors of Nicaraguan society. The Sandinista, so it looks like there's just one dynasty actually. It just ran. It just took it and ran. It looks like it was mainly this one dynasty, and people didn't like it, and so they revolted, and the revolt turned into a revolution. It's not 100% kind of that they were communist. Like, it's kind of so that they were. I mean, I read at least one source, I think 2 or 3 maybe, where they kind of mentioned that the US just took Sandinistas to be, these communists. But they kind of had something more nuanced maybe than that. But I don't know. They're at least seen by people to be communist. And of course, so the other thing here is that this kind of story makes sense for the 50s. When there's kind of real strong anti-communist vibes in the US. But in the 80s, I don't know. I like, in my timeline of history, I kind of feel like people had gotten over a little bit the communists. They'd been like, oh, well, we ran the space race with them. They're kind of similar to us. There was a kitchen debate and stuff, like, they'd seen communists and they weren't so kind of thrown by them, I thought. But then this thing happened, and so maybe I am totally wrong. But yeah, what was I going to say? Yeah, Reagan was, it's interesting. Reagan apparently became anti-communist when he was in, or at least strongly kind of anti-communist when he was in, when he was acting, when he was an actor. But, to me it seemed like he just repurposed the stuff from earlier, the stuff from pre-Vietnam War, and kind of put a new spin on it. Like, this whole thing about Nicaragua being a risk to the US is obviously not true, and also is based on domino theory, which, by the way, in my humble opinion, I actually find domino theory relatively convincing. Actually pretty convincing. But I don't think that it's something to worry about, really. Like, if you're the US, like, I don't know. Like, surely you have the conviction that your system is going to work. Sorry, they should have had the conviction that capitalism was always going to work better than socialism. They should have had people realizing at that time that there are problems with, like, the fundamental like, ways that knowledge is shared in socialism that aren't there in capitalism, like knowledge of, like, that, like, contributes to, like, selling products. And I mean, I could go through a whole economics lesson here, but I'm not going to. But there were fundamental problems, and it should have been something that was realised, and it should have, knowing that, they should have realised, like, oh, let's just focus on us, let's focus on being the best capitalist power we can be, and then, you know, all the rest will follow. Which is kind of what happened. It's just intervening. They fought all these wars and killed all these people. He was kind of this Mormon. He was kind of this modernized version of, like, the whole McCarthy era, like, politics of you know, seeing communists as, like, this huge threat to the US, and seeing them as, like, a real yeah, I mean, equal competitor. I mean, that's kind of what you do. Like, when you're like, oh, I need to really fight these people and kill them all, you actually, like, in a weird way, you are showing everyone that you see them as a real competitor, a real threat. So yeah, I don't know what else to say. Like, oh yeah, Reagan was, like, I don't know, like, I think kind of very free market. I haven't done much research into his actual policies, but from everything that I've read, he was very free market. I'd imagine that he's kind of like an early pioneer of, yeah, I don't know. I feel like neoliberalism is kind of a matter of degree, but he was kind of an early pioneer of that kind of stuff, I would think. He was also friends with Thatcher, and there was something in some documentary where they had, like, oh, that's right, nuclear weapons. He didn't like nuclear weapons. See, this is always one of those things in politics, is that you think you know someone because they're on the left or the right, or they believe one thing or they believe another. But often they have conflicting beliefs, or they have, I mean, it's not even necessarily conflicting, they just have beliefs that are nuanced, or that are kind of situation dependent, whether they're left or right, you know what I mean? And so Thatcher was very pro-nuclear weapons. You know, she thought that they promoted stability in the international system, that the international system was based on international weapons, and he was very anti-international weapons. I found that in, God, I wish my notes were better. I found that in this really good history documentary, which was a bit right-wing, but nonetheless I found to be very entertaining and very bingeable. Like, it was 3 episodes and I watched them all one after the other. They actually had a couple of people on it who were, like, from the Iran-Contra Affair on this history documentary. Okay, I feel like at this point I've done enough background. I feel like a little bit at least, probably about as much as I do about the other players in this story, Saudi Arabia and Israel. Actually, one more thing before we move on. I'll just explain Saudi Arabia's role, and then actually I have to get into affair times, because pre-Iran-Contra Affair, the US had funded Contras before. This was not some newfangled, 1985 turns around and suddenly the US was funding the Contras. There was actually more to it. Oh, and also I have to touch back on hostages, because I didn't just mention hostages pointlessly, or just to explain the previous president. They are actually a key part of this story. A very key part of this story. So yeah, the US had funded the Contras before. So here's a timeline. In the late 1970s, the Contras were formed. It says, the Contras, initially composed of former members of the National Guard and other anti-Sandinista groups, start organising against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. So the Contras existed before the Sandinistas even held government, which is totally wild. Okay, and in 1981, Reagan authorized covert support for the Contras. CIA began providing assistance, training, and funding to anti-Sandinista rebels. Okay, you got that? But here's the kind of interesting thing, which, I mean, if it wasn't illegal already, which is a whole other thing which I'll quickly touch on. I don't know. Do I need to be quick? Do you guys want episodes to be long and chatty and with pauses, or do you want them to be short and sweet? That's a serious question. Let me know. Because personally, if I kind of vibe with a podcast, I like them long. I like that, I mean, I would like a podcast to listen to, but it would take me a whole week to get through each episode, especially if they're coming out weekly. Okay, so yeah, there's this kind of covert support, and this thing, this thing was one of the first things that stood out before I knew much of anything about Iran-Contra. One of the first things that stood out was oh, I had never considered that. The US government is supposed to, this was not something that just came naturally to me, but from my reading, the US Senate and Upper House, what do they call that? Sorry, Lower House and Upper. The Congress, the US Congress is supposed to approve military spending. This was something that sent me on a spiral, because I don't know, when you kind of, realism dominates international relations discourse. I'd always kind of thought that realism was just right, but people wouldn't accept it. Kind of. I mean, I've always thought that I'm a liberal. I've always seen, how do I explain this? I see liberalism as most aligning with a lot of facts, but it is also, even if it doesn't quite make sense to understand some things, or if it has convenient blind spots that I think Marxism can fill in a lot of cases, even if it doesn't understand some things, it has like a positive as in a not like not normatively positive, but kind of in it has solutions, right? Like it has actual solutions, a lot of which have been tried to some extent, so that I quite like a theory where that is the case, and I really don't like theories where all they're doing is just tearing apart everything. And so realism to me is kind of similar to that. I mean, liberalism is a lot based off of realism, to be honest. Like, they take a lot of fundamentals from realism in international relations. I'm talking about neoliberal institutionalism and neo-realism. Anyway, so I've always kind of thought that realism makes sense, but one of the things in realism is that ahistorically, or like without regard to history, there is without regard to history, there is this way of conducting state activities. I don't even want to use the word state, but I have to. Okay, I've been forced. Like, whether you're a Spartan or... The thing about it is that democracy is not considered in it. And this is, why I've always thought, like, oh, that's kind of quite a weak spot in it. And that's a weak spot which liberalism fills. Because it sees democracies actually having impacts on the way that states conduct themselves. But I don't know, I always had in my head that maybe it's true that states, they don't really, I mean, obviously I don't vote really directly on whether we invade China or whatever. There are certain parties maybe that would condone that more or less, but it's kind of among a huge collection of factors, and I don't know, for most people I think, maybe not, I think maybe it depends on where you live, but like for a lot of people voting matters more about, I think, like economic policies, like that will affect you directly. I don't know, for a lot of people. But then, there are also huge other considerations, like big ethical considerations around things like environment and refugees and that sort of thing, which matter a lot to people. And so yeah, I knew that. Like, I knew that, like, oh, well, I don't directly vote on matters of war and peace. That's true, you realists. But I always kind of thought that, like, there is not really any mechanism in kind of most countries, like democratic ones included, for even, like, if you're deciding to go to war. I didn't realize that, like, it's actually something that's voted on by Congress in the US. I can't tell you anything about anywhere else, but I can say that is actually something that is supposed to be voted on by Congress and agreed to. I think by a simple majority, although that is a whole other thing, which sent me down a rabbit hole and I can't work out. But it seems that it's supposed to be a simple majority, as in, like, one more than half of people in both houses of parliament are supposed to agree to go to war. Although now they don't seem to call it going to war anymore. They have this, I think it's like authorization for the use of military force or something like that. Yeah. So there's that. And then I was like, okay, well, that being true for you, the US, why do you have this thing called the CIA, which is out doing all these kind of mysterious, like, war type stuff out there in the world. And does that actually follow the Constitution? Is that constitutional? I hate to be the person to ask that, but is it constitutional? And I did a lot of research, and I could not find a source which could conclusively tell me whether the CIA itself as an institution is constitutional. But I could find a multitude of sources claiming that specific things that the CIA had done are unconstitutional, or would be unconstitutional if, like, it was just the writer of these articles, you know what I mean? Like, so yeah, so that was that. I just kind of thought that was interesting because, like, I mean, I don't know, it doesn't seem to me like there's a whole lot of democratic decision making done around what the CIA does. And so that was one of the concerns that led up to the Boland Amendment, because the CIA and, you know, top brass in the political establishment, Reagan and I guess his cronies as well probably, were moving pre-allocated money to funding the Contras. I'm pretty sure it was like they had allocated money to, I don't know, to military. I mean, that's a huge part of the budget. And they're like, oh, okay, well, we'll just kind of shift some of that to supporting, you know, these thugs in Nicaragua who are, you know, our friends of freedom. Oh, they also, sorry, I said that I was going to cover Saudi Arabia quickly. They set up this funding scheme. It was like a non-profit, and it was called something stupid. It was something stupid. It was something about liberty or freedom or whatever. And its sole purpose was to take money from highfalutin individuals and from governments around the world and spend it on the Contras. And that happened after the Boland Amendment. And one of the contributors was Saudi Arabia, who I'll have to check, but I think they contributed $1 million US a month for the life of that scheme, however long it was. And, like, that was a way of getting around these kind of amendments who were put forward by this Boland guy, who, you know, seems like a really nice guy. But I felt like he was the one person, like, a lot of these people are dead, which is a lot of the reason actually why I'm so happy to cover this story. I have a thing which I'm going to have to work through about covering topics that are too current, because I don't want to hurt anyone, basically. I don't want to offend anyone. Nonetheless, I think I will end up covering current topics. I just need to kind of think about how I'll go about it and how I'll do it sensitively and all of that. But yeah, a lot of these people are dead. And when this guy died, I was like, oh, that's really sad. Like, I actually was about to tear up in this cafe. So I was sweating. Because he seemed like such a nice guy. So he was like, oh, this is fire. He was like kind of a senator. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts. Oh, he was in the army for 2 years, from 1954 to 1956. He was a Democrat. He represented the 7th Congressional District of Missouri. So he was the one campaigning for these amendments, obviously, because that's why they were named after him. And, like, you know, obviously it was a conscience thing. Like, he and a lot of other people, it was a unanimous vote for the First Amendment. saw that the US was being a bad country, basically. Yeah, anyway, so they saw that the US was doing dodgy things, and so they were like, okay, stop. Talk to the hand. We are the Congress, we govern this country. We are going to tell you whether or not you can be doing these stupid spending sprees on thugs in Nicaragua. And so the first Boland Amendment went through, had some loopholes, which I don't entirely understand. Then there was a second Boland Amendment, I think it was even a third, and by the end it was like, there's basically nothing that could be done. So the first Boland Amendment was passed in 1982, according to ChatGPT 3.5. This initial amendment, named after Representative Edward P. Boland, sought to limit the scope of US assistance to the Contras, who were opposing the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Provisions. It prohibited the use of funds for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua, or providing assistance to the Contras for that purpose. Effect. This limited the direct military support to the Contras, but did not completely halt US involvement. And so then, after they realised that it did not completely halt US involvement, they went back and created a new amendment. I don't know how much Boland like this one, but it was still called the Boland Amendment. This one passed in 1984, so a couple of years later. ChatGPT 3.5 says, building on the First Amendment, the Boland Amendment of 1984 further restricted US government support for the Contras. Provisions. It continued to ban military aid to the Contras, but allowed for humanitarian assistance, such as food and medicine. Effect. While it allowed some non-military aid, it maintained constraints on direct military support to the Contras. So that seems like it kind of relaxed it, but relaxed it for clear humanitarian purposes, which is always kind of a problem with sanctions. You see sanctions happening like on countries, like people they really hurt are not the elites. Boland Amendment 1985 purpose. This amendment, also known as Boland 2, responded. Okay, so really there were kind of two amendments. That second one was kind of a fix of the first one's problems, and then they went in hard, I think, with Boland 2. Responded to attempts to circumvent the restrictions outlined in the previous amendment. It reinforced the limitations on US government involvement in military activities against the Nicaraguan government and reiterated the prohibition of military aid. Effect. Boland 2 aimed to close loopholes and prevent covert operations that might undermine the previous amendments. Okay, so from my interpretation, and from the interpretation as well of this documentary, other people said that the Boland amendments were basically just reaffirming what was already in the Constitution, which I assume to be correct because that just makes sense. Anyway, so the Boland amendments stopped all of these dodgy things from going on, all these dodgy transfers of money to the Contras. Little did US public know, it actually didn't. The US kept supporting the Contras until, I don't really know until when. I'm pretty sure I know until when. I'm pretty sure it wrapped up as soon as this plane went down over Nicaragua. And that is going to be the topic of when I come back.